You've trekked around the hills a bit, is that right? Good. Yeah, I've tried to keep up with Mike in field trips, and he doesn't walk. He runs, because things are exciting, and I want to say a personal note of appreciation for Mike, teaching me to look at landforms. No matter where I go now, I look differently because of his input in saying, let's look at the landscape, let's look at things and figure out what happened using a biblical time frame. His bio reads, he earned his BS and MS degrees in atmospheric science from the University of Washington, along with being a research meteorologist at the University of Washington. Michael worked for 30 years with the National Weather Service. He's authored and co-authored or served as editor of 21 creationist books, which we carry a lot of, and has published over 200 related articles on creation science and technical literature. Articles written by Michael on the flood and the Ice Age may be found at his website, and I'm sure you'll give that on your screen up here, right? No? Well, anyway. I also would like to say, I don't know when he sleeps, because he reads and he writes so much, and I just think we need to keep praying for Mike because he's on the cutting edge of so much good research. We're so glad to have you here, Mike. Come on up.
Well, thank you, Steve, for that introduction. The title of this talk is about dating methods. And if some of you heard about this and came here to learn about male-female dating methods, you're in the wrong audience. This is about radiometric dating. Anyway, we hear about millions of years, billions of years, in other words, deep time, all through our culture. Even in Christian circles, a lot of our professors at university just assume they're true. And here's a quote from Christianity Today, Carl Giberson. Agree among yourselves that the earth is old, since science has proven it. Okay? And here's Davis Young, retired professor of geology at Calvin College. The Christian who believes that the idea of an ancient earth is unbiblical would do better to deny the validity of any kind of historical geology and insist that the rocks must be the product of pure miracle, rather than try to explain them in terms of the flood. An examination of the earth apart from ideological presuppositions, see, that's what he's gotten into, and that's why he believes in millions of years, is bound to lead to the conclusion that it is ancient, that the earth is ancient. And here's another quote from James Boyce. We have to admit here that the exegetical basis of the creationist is strong from the Bible, that the earth is young, which I'll get into. But in spite of the careful biblical and scientific research that has accumulated in support of the creationist view, there are problems that make the theory wrong to most, including many evangelical scientists. Data from various disciplines point to a very old earth and an even older universe. Data. He thinks all this has been proved by observational science, but it's really an interpretation of observational science. So he thinks it's data. And here's another one, Gleason Archer. Many of these guys are great when they get into their field of like Old Testament, like Gleason Archer. But him and many other scholars have bought into the idea of deep time. From a superficial reading of Genesis 1, okay, superficial, huh? The impression would seem to be that the entire creative process took place in 6 24-hour days. Yeah, it would seem that way. Maybe it is. If this was the true intent of the Hebrew author, This seems to run counter to modern scientific research, which indicates that the planet Earth was created several billion years ago. In other words, they buy into what modern science says about the age of the Earth, the age of the universe, and so forth. Research. It's not research, it's interpretation based on a certain worldview that they have assumed for well over 200 years, as I'll get into. Okay, when we hear statements like this is my theme verse for all my research. 1 Thessalonians 5:21. It's like the Bereans. Check it out. Gather the observations and the real data and see if it says so. So examine everything carefully. You got to be careful. If you can't or you don't have time to examine something carefully, don't make decisions. Don't jump to conclusions. You need more data. It's something that people violate all the time, jumping to conclusions with too little information. So they jump to wrong conclusions. But you got to hold fast that which is good. Hold fast to the Bible as God's Word. That's what you need to do, and that's what I've been doing for about 50 years. So in this talk, I'm going to have 5 points. Ages are important. This is an important issue. The Bible says the earth and the universe are young. Secular dating methods say old, but they have many problems. There are dating methods indicating the earth is young. And there's a lot of claimed slow processes, it takes millions of years for coal or oil to form, things like that. We've all heard things like that. But you bring the flood back into our thinking, you could produce these things rapidly. So those are the 5 things. So is the age of the earth and old dates important? Well, here's a quote from Davis Young and Ralph Sturley. Ralph Sturley is the current geology professor at Calvin College. In this book, which I've reviewed, it's a horrible book because they hardly reference any of our material, and they build a bunch of straw man arguments about what we believe that are easy to cut down with a sword. So anyway, they said in this, we have also concluded that the Bible is not concerned about the age of the earth at all. Okay? Implying that you don't have to be either. The Bible leaves it up to humans to try to figure out how old the earth is, if that is a question that interests us. In other words, these guys have already compromised with deep time, and they're trying to say, well, don't worry about it. It's not important. That's what they're trying to tell us. But there is a lot. It is important, especially when you look at some statistics. 89% of Christian students attend public school. 66% who attend church in high school will leave the church after they leave home. 2 out of 3 young people. That's why we're losing the young people. Why? Answers in Genesis tried to find out why. They did a poll of 1,000 20 to 29-year-olds, former evangelicals. So they had to, I think, poll 30,000 people or something to find out why they left. And so 40% first had doubts about the Bible in middle school. See, it starts with doubt in the Bible as God's Word. And 44% had doubts in high school. 11% had their doubts in college. So a lot of times it starts in middle school or high school or even before middle school, because they throw around the millions and billions of years as if they're a fact. And another question asked, do you believe the earth is less than 10,000 years old? No, 57%. Don't know, 20%. So many of them don't believe the earth is young. And another question, has old ages caused you to doubt? Yes, 46%. So that was the seed that caused them to doubt. Not necessarily evolution, but the millions of years starts the doubt, and they go down the slippery slope, and by the time they leave for college, they've already rejected Christianity and the Bible. In fact, you can get this information in Ken Ham's book, Already Gone. In other words, while they're at home going through high school, grades 1 to 12, they're already gone mentally, even though you can't tell. And some of you might have had this experience, parents and grandparents, with this happening to you. So it is an important issue. Important. The Bible says the earth is young. Well, how so? Well, first of all, the Bible has withstood the test of time by an army of critics. We have thousands of ancient manuscripts, including the Dead Sea Scrolls, that show that the Bible we have now is very close to the original Bible that was written. Also, we have numerous fulfilled prophecy. Archaeological verification, especially in this area, most archaeologists are atheists, you might not be aware of. And they're always trying to disprove the Bible, and they've said a lot of things like David never existed, Pilate never existed. I mean, all kinds of things, but it usually doesn't take too long before archaeology digs up proof that they did. Indicating the Bible is God's Word. And there's thousands of statements thought true by man at the time, but they're false. Like women have blue blood and men have red blood. But none of those false statements made it into the Bible at the time. This was Jerry Bergman has wrote an article about 15 years ago on this in the Creation Research Society Quarterly. So the Bible is accurate. We can trust it. We can trust it with its science, with deep time, that evolution's false. So what does the Bible say about the age of the earth? Well, you can simply add up those genealogies in Genesis 5, 10, and 11, and there you go. Created in 6 days, age of the earth 0, so forth. Adam was 130 years old when Seth was born. So when Seth was born, the age of the earth was 130 years. And you can keep going and going and going and going. Makes good bedtime reading, doesn't it? And the flood was 1,656 years after creation. Then after the flood, we have Shem to Abraham, Genesis 11 to 12, so forth, so on. You can keep going and going. And Israelites lived in Egypt. Now, some people don't think they lived there 430 years. I think that's controversial now, but I don't know enough about that idea to have an opinion. And so forth, so on. And so the age of the earth at Christ's birth, 4,003 years. And this was done in 2005, so it was a little more than 6,000 years just from the genealogies. Of course, the genealogies aren't perfect. There's a few glitches when you compare the genealogies in, Luke 3, Matthew 1, and so forth. So number of scholars have used these and come up with slightly different dates. Not a big deal. But Genesis 1 to 11, that's where the controversy on origins is. Genesis 1 to 11, the creation, the fall into sin, the flood, the Tower of Babel. But Jesus quoted from Genesis 1 to 11, or believe Genesis 1 to 11 were facts. For instance, Matthew 24, 37 to 39, in Olivet Discourse says, but as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. See, Jesus believed Noah was a real person. This wasn't a local flood, a mythological person. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered into the ark. Jesus believed in a real ark. And knew not until the flood came and took a few of them away in a local flood, the Tigris-Euphrates River, took them all away. So shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Oh, but all, that word all down there, that could mean just the region. And that's true, it is used in that sense sometimes. But Jesus is comparing his second coming with the flood. And in Revelations 1:7 it says, when he comes back, all eyes will see him. That's going to be a global coming back. He's not going to compare a global coming back to a local flood, is he? But to a global flood. So that all means all people were taken away. He believed in Genesis was correct. And Jesus did have a few comments on the age of the earth. For instance, it says in Mark 13:19, "For those days will be a time of tribulation, such as not occurred since the beginning of creation, which God created until now and never will be." In other words, there's been tribulation since the beginning of creation. There wasn't any huge gap between Adam and the creation. Like the gap theory says there's 4.6 billion years between the creation and the recreation starting with Adam. But it was right from the beginning. Tribulation started. And Mark 10:6, defending marriage, says, "But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female." From the beginning of creation, not millions of years afterwards. So God believed, Jesus said that the earth is young. And he says it again, "So that the blood of all the prophets shed since the foundation of the world," since the very beginning, "may be charged against this generation. From the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah." In other words, Abel lived since near the foundation of the world. And anyway, here's those various scholars over the years trying to figure out the age of the earth before 1869. Most people go with Usher, who is where? Isaac Newton did it too, and I don't see his name here either. Anyway, a lot of scholars have done this. Now, there's a little different. If you use the Septuagint, you have to add maybe, 1,000 years or so. But most people use the Masoretic script. So anyway, it's thousands of years. And then people get hung up on the word day. So you got to, day can mean a 24-hour literal day, the daylight portion of the day, or a vague period of time, like the day of the Lord. And so the context always tells you what it is. So you look at the use of the word day outside of Genesis 1, and day with a number. Notice they use numbers in evening and morning, the first day, so forth. It's used 410 times. In the rest of the Old Testament, it always means a 24-hour day. Evening and a morning, both either together without day or with day, always means a literal 24-hour day. And night with day 52 times. So I'd say the context obviously means Jesus created in 6 literal days. And that's what the Bible says. And a lot of people admit that's what the Bible says, even though they don't believe it. So, ages are important. They're driving a lot of young people away from the church, thinking that, the science, they'll say it's science. It's interpretations of certain data in the present. It's really not science, strictly defined. They think science has disproved the Bible, and it's a fairy tale. So, and they learn this in the culture, especially the public schools. So they are important. The Bible says the earth is young, the universe is young. Well, now they got a lot of dating methods. Secular dating methods say old, but these dating methods have lots of problems. I'll be going on that next. But first of all, it's important to know the assumptions behind these dating methods as well as evolution. The evolutionary assumptions, only slow processes are allowed to explain all the rocks, the fossils, and so forth. It's called uniformitarianism. Now, this is a word that practically all of you should know. It's their idea of how to explain everything by present processes extrapolated over millions of years. Think of uniform or present processes that we see going on today. And this was assumed since the late 1700s. And in the late 1700s, the universe and Earth became old automatically. Because of course, if you look at the Grand Canyon, it would take millions of years to deposit all that sediment in the shallow sea or wherever they think the environment is. So old age was assumed since 1700. And then evolution is a fact. It didn't come around for quite a while. People hesitated to think that we evolved. No, we don't want any slow processes of forming any biology. So they resisted for a long time, but finally they believed it was proved by Charles Darwin, which it wasn't. And it became a fact since the mid-1700s. And in all this process, no creator is needed or allowed. It becomes an atheistic worldview. And Martin Rudwick has a PhD in geology. He's written about the history of all this. And he's written 2 books about it. Bursting the Limits of Time is one of them. The limits of time were where people believed the biblical worldview up until about the late 1700s, that the earth was young. But the limits were burst. And he kind of indicates, he has a quote here about, in the book Alpine Travels, 1779. He says, for example, in the opening sentence of his Alpine Travels, Saussure claimed that it was universally accepted. And he meant, of course, among savants, that's your scholars, that's what they called them in those days, and other educated readers, that the Earth's past revolutions or major changes had occupied a long succession of ages. So they've been assuming the Earth has been old since the late 1700s. So this is a very important point. If they assumed it this long, they always looked for methods of dating that prove their bias. This is a human tendency, is see only what you want to believe. It's been assumed. And this was at a time when they knew hardly anything about geology. They did not even know the origin of basalt or granite. They did not, something as basic as basalt, a lava that extrudes on the surface, and granite, which is a plutonic igneous rock that stays under the ground. They didn't know the origin of that. And so they made these decisions when they didn't have enough data. And they've been locked in concrete ever since. These assumptions are dogma at the universities. And with these biases, of course they're going to find systems that give you old ages, because that's what they believe. But we need to realize that rocks and sedimentary rocks, do not come with dates on them. The dates are interpretations of evidence in the present. Interpretation, not data. And there's many indications the millions of years do not exist. I'll get into that after the intermission. For instance, you don't find a bone with a date on it of 65 million years. Anyway, these are the only rocks that have dates on them right here. This was taken around Arco, Idaho. There's another one in north of Wenatchee, I think, I've seen. Anyway, there's 3 main dating challenges for creation scientists. The starlight and time, or the speed of light. In other words, stars that are billions of light years out there need billions of years to travel to hit the Earth. Second one is radiometric dating techniques. And third are those slow processes they say take way too much time, like coal and oil. I'm going to give you some examples after the intermission on the slow processes. But I'm going to briefly talk about starlight and time problem. For instance, people who believe in the Big Bang have the same problem. It's called the horizon problem. And I got this from Jason Lyle's book. It's difficult to explain, but if you've heard of the cosmic background radiation, where the temperature of the radiation that hits us, microwave radiation, has all the same temperatures. I think it's 2.7 degrees Kelvin, 2.7 degrees above absolute zero. It's all the same, or nearly all the same. If you had a real fine measurements, you can find little differences. But in order for this to happen in the Big Bang, every point in the universe has to communicate with each other by radiation, absorbed, re-radiate, back and forth. And so as this material spreads out, they got to communicate. And they got to communicate in well below a microsecond, so fast. One website, I looked on Wikipedia, believed that this radiation had to be going 1 million times the speed of light to do this. So they have a speed of light problem, just like we do. And we have about 5 theories on it, by the way, I might add. But it hasn't been solved yet by us or by them. So we're both in the same boat. Most people don't know that they're challenged just like we are. In fact, the Lord has led me over 50 years of research to answer challenges that they give us. And you know, one of the first things I discover when I look at a subject in depth, I find that they're challenged also. A lot of times they can bluff their way through it, add another hypothesis, or say, hey, give us more grant money and maybe 10 years down the road we'll solve it. So anyway, and then the second challenge is radioactivity. A lot of elements are radioactive, especially when they have too many neutrons. And so they give off energy, which is radiation, and particles. Now, some radioactivity is not giving off a particle like an alpha particle, which is a helium nucleus that grabs 2 electrons and becomes a helium atom. Anyway, here's some of the methods. Now, many of you have heard this. Potassium, radioactive potassium, that is, potassium-40, changes to argon. Uranium changes to lead. Thorium changes to lead. Samarium changes to neodymium. And rubidium changes to strontium. Those are about the 5 main dating methods, and they date rocks. So, in dating a rock, they have to make certain assumptions. First of all, they date when the lava, it has to be something that was molten to start with, a rock that was molten, and it cools and hardens and becomes a rock. That's when you date the time it becomes a rock. And you can think of it like an hourglass using the uranium lead method. So when it cools and becomes a rock, it's sealed, supposedly, a closed system they call it. And so the uranium will decay by radioactivity into lead. But it's like an hourglass at a certain rate of change. And here's they call that the parent element, and this is the daughter element, lead. And by the way, uranium goes through, I think, 18 steps before it gets to lead, including radon. And radon is coming up in a lot of our basements. We have to mitigate it if we have too much of it. And that's because it leaks out of the rocks. It leaks. It's not a closed system a lot of times. So anyway, they always use it by the half-life. The parent changing to the daughter with time. And so when half of it's gone, that's called the half-life, right? Like that. And the half-lives of these are in billions of years usually. And so so another half-life, you got half of it, another half-life, only you have a quarter left from the beginning. And then 1/8, and finally a 16th. So that's the way it decays with time. Then they use the half-life. So there's 3 main assumptions for each dating method, or for all dating methods, radiometric dating methods. By the way, each method also has other assumptions peculiar to that method. The initial conditions must be known. You need to know how much uranium is in the rock to start with and how much lead. And by the way, they always start with some lead. You might think it's 0, but it's not. So, you got to know that at the beginning when it cooled billions of years ago, supposedly. Also, the rock must remain closed. No uranium can go in or out, or lead come in and out. And it has to be a constant rate of decay for millions and billions of years. Those are the 3 main assumptions. And by the way, they find that their dating methods violate these assumptions fairly frequently, and that's their excuse to throw out bad dates, usually, by violating one of these 3 assumptions. So here's what we can think of in the dating problems with this hourglass idea. You need to know the starting amount of uranium, the starting amount of lead. Also, you can't gain any uranium from the environment into the rock, and you can't gain any lead from the environment into the rock. And we know uranium moves pretty good with water, and radium does too. A lot of these elements can be leached by water. They can move around in rocks, in and out of rocks. Also, you can't lose any uranium for millions of years, and you can't lose any lead for millions of years. And the rate has to be the same. Those are the illustration of the three main dating method assumptions behind all radiometric dates. And like I said, each dating method has also more assumptions peculiar to that particular one. So, when we test radiometric dating methods, do they work reliably on rocks of known age? And do the different techniques agree consistently? Well, creation scientists have done a lot of work on this. Like, here's the dome of Mount St. Helens, for instance. That dome has been coming up and building, and Dr. Steve Austin took samples and sent them to the dating laboratories, and here's the ages he got for when the lava cooled in that lava dome. And that lava dome is, it was only 10 years old. Anyway, here's the different potassium-argon, KARs, potassium-argon ages for different parts of the rock. These are different minerals or the whole rock. Get different ages. But regardless, they're hundreds of thousands or millions of years when it cooled. So something's wrong somewhere. And there's a mountain in North New Zealand called Mount Ngauruhoe that Andrew Snelling has dated, and it's been erupting regularly over historical times. So these are some of the eruptions, and here's some of the lava that's come out, and he dated those. And here's a thin section of the lava. Anyway, here's some of the measurements. You got potassium argon ages range from 0 to 3.5 million years, and yet they cooled in recent times. So a lot of times these dating methods don't agree with rocks of known age. And the Grand Canyon. On the northwest rim of Grand Canyon, you had a lot of basalt flows that erupted on top of the rim, and they flowed down into the Grand Canyon. If anyone's flowed the Grand Canyon, you've seen these. Anyway, they've dated that lava. It's pretty young. The cones are sharp. They're not very old. And the lava. Also, there's lava flows down in the bottom of the Grand Canyon. There's black areas right in here. Cardenas basalt right there. Anyway, the rubidium-strontium isochrone method is considered one of the best methods of all. And it dated that Cardenas basalt at a little more than 1 billion years old. But the same method dated this young basalt at 1.34 billion years old. So there's something wrong somewhere. And not only that, different dating methods gave different ages. KR, potassium argon ages, there's those, rubidium-strontium isochrone, lead isochrone. You could see that they varied. The ages are inconsistent with different methods. And in Australia, you had a layer of basalt below sand and clay, and it was dated 255 million years old. But there's wood discovered down there, but the basalt was dated 45 million years old, and the carbon-14 dated the wood 44 to 45,000 years. Quite a difference. So, carbon-14. By the way, carbon-14 does not date rocks, it dates carbon. And where you get this carbon-14, it comes from the nitrogen in the atmosphere by bombardment of cosmic rays. and they produce fast neutrons that collide with the nitrogen, and nitrogen-14, and produces carbon-14. And carbon-14 is radioactive carbon, and it decays with a half-life of 5,730 years. So it's real short half-life. And animals absorb carbon-14 through their life, through the vegetation, because it combines with oxygen to form carbon dioxide. So it's spread all through the biology of the earth. So he gains it like a moose. So he gains it, but then it's decaying. But then when it dies, you don't gain any more. You don't eat any more food to gain any carbon-14. So it's always being lost, and so forth. You can date it by the amount of loss based on a few assumptions. So we have dated diamonds. Well, first of all, since carbon-14 has a half-life of only 5,730 years, if you get about beyond 15 half-lives, you can't detect any more carbon-14 in the system. So if it's older than 80,000 years, you shouldn't be able to detect any carbon-14. But if you do, it's younger than 80,000 years. So we dated coal. They've dated coal. Coal is pure carbon, almost pure carbon, and they got dates. They got dates of less than 50,000 years, and coal is supposed to have been formed 15 million to 350 million years ago, depending on which rocks you find them in. So they say, well, it's contaminated. I mean, this is probably several hundred times it's been dated. Okay, every time? Contaminated? You know, when you take a sample of coal, you try hard not to find areas that are contaminated. How would it be contaminated? Well, a crack goes through it, and then you have modern carbon that slips down through there and is with the sample. That's their idea of contamination. But that's not very logical that should be the case with hundreds of coal samples. So we humored them, and we decided we're going to date something that can't be contaminated, diamonds. This is research done by John Baumgartner. I'll give you the references where you can read all about this. I don't have them at my book table, but they might over at that book table, or you can get them online. Anyway, he dated these diamonds that are supposed to be 1 to 2 billion years old, and he got ages of around 58,000 years for 12 diamonds, indicating diamonds are less than 80,000 years old, if you find any carbon-14 in it. So diamonds are young. And he's presented this at secular conferences. And, you know, they try to shoot this all down, but, you know, it's pretty tough to shoot it down. But because of their bias, they have to shoot it down, because they're not going to give up the deep time, by the way. So, diamonds. And carbon-14, we're still working on this, but this is how we think it works. Carbon-14 is 1 out of 1.2 trillion carbon atoms. And we think the dating methods would agree with the creation flood model to about 3,000 years. But during the time of the Ice Age and afterwards, all of them telescope down to the time of the flood. So when they get dates of, say, 40,000 years on a woolly mammoth, we would date it somewhere up in this area right in here. So why should that be? We're still working on that. It could be we had more cosmic rays forming more carbon-14 during the Ice Age and the flood. Or Russell Humphreys has thought that maybe the effects are from the sun, effects on the sun. But anyway, I have had no trouble being skeptical of all these things, because as a weather forecaster, I've done this to people. I've ruined probably thousands of outdoor activities. Forecast of 100% chance of sunshine. You know, when I first got in the National Weather Service, we can barely forecast the weather the next day. This is the problem. But I must say that the models are so good, you can count on them for 5 days now. Things have really advanced, and I thank Dan Letha for this cartoon. So it wasn't hard for me to be skeptical of the millions of years to start with, because I realized that these things aren't really that accurate. Anyway, they still give billions of years. Why do these dating methods give billions and millions of years? Well, Russell Humphreys did a research project on granite in a core in New Mexico. Granite is made up of 4 types of minerals. The black minerals are either amphibole or biotite mica. Biotite's the black mica. Muscovite is the white clear mica, or I should say transparent. Anyway, the biotite has a lot of zircon crystals in it, and they're highly radioactive. And so this is what a zircon crystal looks like. And so you have to have about the same size in this. So they're very small. And they contain a lot of uranium and thorium that changes to lead with time. So when uranium decays radioactively to lead, it gives off 8 helium atoms. Actually 8 helium nuclei that grab electrons from the environment and then become helium atoms. A helium atom has 2 neutrons and 2 protons and 2 electrons. So he dated the zircon, the uranium changing to lead by measuring these, and you got a calculated age of 1.5 billion years based on the uranium lead. But the helium, there's so much helium in these zircon crystals that they were much younger. And you had to determine the helium leak rate, called diffusion, from the zircon into the biotite and into the rest of the granite. And there's nothing stopping it from going out there. So it leaks at a certain rate. And they determined the leak rate and the amount of helium in there. It gave an age of about 6,000 years. What gives? Well, diffusion, or the leak rate, is a very well understood physical process. Radioactive dating, still there's some things we don't know about it. And so the only way to reconcile these is that in the last approximately 6,000 years, we had accelerated radiometric decay, of which everything accelerated. The rate wasn't the same. It was much higher in the past. Where, when, and why? Was it the creation, or at the flood, or both? We don't really know that. How many have heard of this research on accelerated radiometric decay? I want to just kind of see how many people are, good amount of you. This is pretty powerful evidence that sometime in the past, all those radiometric methods, they accelerated. And that's why they give billions and millions of years. And by the way, this research was sponsored by the Institute of Creation Research and the Creation Research Society, and they spent $1.5 million on all this because they had to send all this material to standard labs to analyze the ages and stuff like that. So in Humphrey's helium diffusion experiment, he found, this is a summary, biotite does not impede helium diffusion. It doesn't stop it, it just goes right out through it. Zircons contain too much helium for their supposed age of 1.5 billion years. And the only solution is accelerated radiometric decay sometime in the past. And these are very solid results. Of course, the secular scientists don't like it, and they've tried to shoot it down, and it failed miserably. Humphreys once in a while has answers their challenges in the standard creation science literature. The only question is, when did the radiometric day occur? The conclusion is that radiometric dates are wrong. That's the big conclusion. Anyway, we'll have an intermission for 20 minutes, and I'll come back and talk about the last 2 topics.
And just a quick announcement.
Well, I made a case that this is an important issue. We can't neglect it. It has been neglected, and we're losing a lot of young people, especially, to deep time, and they end up rejecting the Bible afterwards. The Bible says it's young. Secular dating methods say it's old, but they have many problems. I only scratched the surface on the problems. Now I'm going to talk about there are dating methods indicating the earth is young. And I'll talk also about claimed slow processes can be fast during the flood. The flood is the great time cruncher, I like to say. Anyway, here's a list that was put out by Answers in Genesis about almost 20 years ago. Hundreds of physical processes. A dating method is anything that changes with time from one thing to another, or one aspect. A change with time, essentially. So you can use a lot of these and show that the earth is young. One of the new ones is soft tissue, soft dinosaur tissue that's not fossilized, and it should have decayed. We're now finding protein molecules, bone cells, even red blood cells and blood vessels, and tissue that stretches. This stuff should decay in thousands of years at the most, and yet for dinosaurs, they supposedly died out 65 million years ago. That's one I'm not going to go into, but we have lots of those. But here's just a few. The salt in the ocean indicates that the oceans are young, a lot younger than they say. So you have inputs and outputs and divide the difference into the amount still in the ocean. Salt leaves the ocean, by the way, a lot of times from sea spray and the wind, and it evaporates the water, and the salt is left in the atmosphere. Anyway, the amount of salt in the ocean indicates that the oceans are no more than 62 million years old, based on the amount of salt. But very likely much less than that. If we bring the flood back into the Earth history, during the flood, you're going to, as you erode rock, a lot of that rock will have dissolved minerals that'll end up in the ocean after the flood. So with the flood, you can add practically all the salt that's in there right now. But regardless, it doesn't fit a billion-year time scale. It's supposed to have existed, the ocean's supposed to exist about 3 billion years. Oops, went too fast on that slide. 3 billion years old, but it's less than 62 million years ago, but it could be much less. I'd say it was much less because of the flood adding the salt. Also, the amount of sediments in the ocean. You can calculate the amount of sediments, how much is running off the continents into the oceans, how much is leaving by subduction, if that subduction really occurs. And I haven't made up my mind on that yet. Anyway, and you find out that based on the amount of sediments, the oceans are less than 12 million years old. Anyway, the decay of short period comets. A comet goes around the sun, a short period one, out by Jupiter and around the sun within 200 years. There's long period comets, which we only see maybe once, and they have a real flat elliptical orbit. They go way out in what's called the Kuiper belt beyond Neptune and around the sun. But short period comets, there's several hundred of them still left. And so when a comet goes around the sun, that tail is the losing of matter. They're not very big, maybe 10 kilometers, 40 kilometers in diameter. And they're not bound very tightly either. So they're losing matter. Every time a comet goes around the sun, its tail goes is formed by radiation pressure from the sun. So it's away from the sun. and they're always losing matter. So you can't have these things going around forever or for a long time. And based on the amount we have, several hundred, and the fact that we don't ever observe any new ones coming in, we always just see them destroyed. We have seen them split apart. Some have hit Jupiter, so they're being destroyed now. So this puts a maximum age around 50,000 years for the age of the solar system. Also, shorelines are eroding. Here's the chalk cliffs in England, and based on the erosion, 21 meters in 170 years, and you see the rate about 0.12 meters per year, it would erode 8,000 kilometers since the Cretaceous, which was 65 million years ago in the evolutionary time scale. Yeah, coastal areas are eroding so fast, continents can't be more than several million years at that rate. So, a lot of dating methods say the Earth is young. Now I'm going to talk about the claimed slow processes. Here's some of them right here, coal and oil. Now all these can be formed rapidly during the flood. Oil is from the destroyed organisms, and plus maybe some oil from the mantle. Coal is compressed vegetation. Thick sediments. Valleys and canyons can form rapidly when they say, well, the river it would take 1 million years to form these deep valleys. Dinosaur tracks and eggs, and Ice Age, the Ice Age. And I'm only going to showcase the last two. I've worked on a lot of these over the years. And so I'm going to say one thing about rapid valleys and canyons. And this is where the uniformitarian idea makes you think a different way. So if you believe in uniformitarianism, you start off with a river on flat land, and with time it forms a valley, like right in here. And it might take 100,000 years, 1 million years, depending on the depth and how much erosion's occurring. That's what you would be thinking of as a uniformitarian to what you see today. But during the flood, when the flood currents channelize, they can dig out a canyon or a valley rapidly, like this right here, when it channelizes. Bring back the flood, we can solve practically all those challenges that they claim would take too much time. And there's several hundred of them too, by the way. In fact, I do a lot of my research dealing with that issue. Anyway, I'm going to showcase mainly the last two. Dinosaur tracks, eggs, and scavenged bone beds. Now, it's a real surprise for them to discover dinosaur tracks and eggs, dinosaur eggs. There's millions of dinosaur tracks, millions of dinosaur eggs in the rocks, in the sedimentary rocks. And there's evidence that some of the bone beds, and some of these dinosaur bone beds have over 10,000 dinosaurs in them, all jumbled up sometimes. And we notice in some bone beds that we find the teeth of carnivorous dinosaurs in the bone bed, but not the rest of the skeleton, indicating that they broke their teeth while scavenging dead dinosaurs. And sometimes we find teeth marks on bones. So anyway, here's an old slide from the late 1900s of dinosaur tracks around the Earth, around the world. There's a lot more that have been added since, even in Greenland here. There's one real interesting one on Spitsbergen right here. And then north slope of Alaska, you find them in Denali. I've seen them in Denali before, right in the central Alaska. And now in Southwest. So there's a lot more. They're finding more and more every year. And here's a dinosaur track of a 3-toed carnivorous dinosaur, about the size of Velociraptor in northeast Wyoming. And here's a large duck-billed dinosaur track found on top of a coal mine in Utah. Yeah, you find dinosaur tracks on tops of coal mines. In Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, the United Kingdom, and Queensland, Australia. Now that brings up a way you can form coal by this model that I developed called the BEDS model. BEDS, briefly exposed diluvial sediments. This was considered a major contradiction to creation scientists, saying, well, how could the chaos of the flood produce millions of dinosaur tracks and dinosaur eggs, you know? So I thought about it, and I produced this hypothesis called the BEDS hypothesis, which I'll get into. Anyway, here's a location of a bunch of dinosaur eggs, and this is an old slide from the late 1990s, and so they've added more throughout the years. But you can see they're global. And here is a picture of one from Mongolia. This is the first set of dinosaur eggs found in Mongolia in about 1922. And there was a gap in time before they found any more. And I think it was in the 1960s they found them in Montana. More dinosaur eggs in Montana. And then all over the world. And here's a tooth from, I think, a T-Rex in a bone bed that we found. It's get broken off. See, they lose their teeth, but their teeth grow back. So, and here's a bone has tooth marks on it, a dinosaur bone from the Blackfeet Indian Reservation. There's some great stuff on the Blackfeet Indian Reservation. But you can't get on it. But we had special permission. We had an Indian guide. So anyway, we found some great stuff. So here's how the BEDS model works. In order to make tracks, it's got to be land. And they're practically all in flat bedding plains. And they're always usually found in areas where there's thick sedimentary rocks. And there's evidence of a lot of sedimentary rocks that were on top of it that were eroded during the runoff part of the flood. A great amount of erosion occurred as the floodwaters are running off. I calculated an average just recently of about 1,900 meters as the average erosion of the continents when the floodwaters are running off. This is based on the amount of sediments in the ocean, which now they have a good calculation of that. Anyway, here's 3 time slices. At time 1, it's rather deep water, but it's rapidly forming sediments. And then time 2, it's up here, and time 3, it's right up here, and it's close to the top of the floodwaters. Now the floodwaters in 371 days just don't go up gently and just go down. They oscillate a lot. There's a lot of mechanisms that cause them to oscillate. At least 5 I figured. So when you reach this point, at time 4, suddenly you have one of those oscillations that drop the level of the seawater, and you have a flat bedding plane. By the way, these are just think of these boxes like this as representing 100 miles, an area 100 miles. And so suddenly you drop the level of the floodwaters and you expose a freshly laid bedding plane. See, the dinosaur tracks and all that material are on the bedding planes. And so the dinosaurs come from higher ground or for swimming, come up on it, make tracks, lay eggs, and scavenge dead ones. Now, they can be exposed for a matter of a short period of time to maybe a week or more. They can be exposed depending on the mechanism that exposes the sediment. And then, but a local rise covers up all that material and lays more sediment and preserves it. So you got to preserve that. Tracks, I mean, they're ephemeral. They will disappear quickly. And so you got to preserve them. See, the secular scientists have problems explaining how they're preserved. especially in soft sediments, they're just not going to be very distinct. They're going to wash away or disappear in the air in a matter of weeks to months at the best. So here's a little diagram. Just think of this area as maybe 100 miles wide. And you have a drop in the level of the floodwaters, exposing the freshly laid bedding plains. And so they make tracks, lay eggs. And then they have a rise, and it'll either drive them off, or in this case, in this schematic, they stayed there, or most of them stayed there. And sediments were laid down, and they did it again. See, there's various levels you can find in a region where you find tracks and eggs at several levels. And so you can account for this in a region of oscillating sea levels. So this can account for live dinosaurs early in the flood, making tracks, eggs, and scavenging dead dinosaurs, like right in here. And you can learn all about it in this book, Dinosaur Challenges and Mysteries. But it focuses on tracks, eggs, nests, and bone beds. Ice ages, as you know, I've spent 50 years studying the Ice Age, and I have a number of resources out there and a lot of articles on the creation websites. Anyway, I'm just going to go briefly through this. You can get more information on this later. Anyway, the secular scientists have 5 Ice Age periods, starting with the oldest in the mid-Precambrian around 2,000 million years ago. Then they got several in the late Precambrian during that time period, 600 to 900 million years ago. Late Ordovician, late Paleozoic. These are all terms from the geological column, by the way. If you're not familiar with them, don't worry about them. But this is the dates they give them. 280 million years ago for the late Paleozoic. And the Pleistocene, which is it's less than 2.6 million years now. So there's 5 Ice Age periods. Now, practically all creation scientists would believe that these are flood rocks. So how do you get these Ice Age deposits in flood rocks? Well, you don't from an Ice Age, but there's another way to account for these, and it's by gigantic landslides. They can duplicate a lot of the processes of an Ice Age. See, as a landslide moves along the ground, it can scratch the bedrock, just like a glacier can. And that's some of their evidence that they use. And when you end up, the landslide debris looks like glacial debris. They call it glacial till. So, I believe these 4 were formed during the flood by gigantic landslides. Well, this one right here is the real Ice Age, but only their last, because they now have 50 Ice Ages in this time period, by the way. 50, yeah. Anyway, if you want to know more about it, I wrote this book long ago. It's 30 years old now. Ancient Ice Ages or Gigantic Submarine Landslides. Okay, for the Pleistocene, they started off with 1 Ice Age. And by the way, when the Ice Age first came about starting in about 1840, it was a challenge to uniformitarianism because there wasn't any ice over much of Scandinavia or northern United States or Canada. So it was against uniformitarianism. And so Charles Lyell, who cemented uniformitarianism in the minds of scientists between 1830 and 1833 when he wrote his 3-volume Principles of Geology, he never believed in the Ice Age because it was against uniformitarianism. But when the Ice Age came out, it was an assault against that. So it took about 20 or 30 years for them to accept it all. All scientists accepted it. Charles Lyell was passed away by that time. But the evidence for the Ice Age on the surface of the earth, on top of flood rocks, indicates that it's post-flood. And there's so much evidence out there, thousands of pieces of evidence for the Ice Age. Like this is on the top of the Sierra Mountains. Scratched and polished granite. some of the erratic boulders you see left over. And here's one of my favorite Ice Age slides. This is the northeast Wallowa Mountains. They're Enterprise, Oregon. And here's the beautiful Lake Wallowa, I think. And notice that horseshoe-shaped feature out on the plains from the mountains. And this is over Deepen Lake, sort of like a fjord on land, but fjords are along the coasts of like British Columbia, Norway. So what is this? Well, when you look at it from down below, it's a lateral moraine from about 2,000 feet of ice in that valley there, and you can see the trees for scale. This lateral moraine is 600 feet tall. See, the moraine is formed by when ice comes out, it brings the debris with it. And when it melts, it leaves the debris as a ridge usually. If it's along the side of the glacier, it's called a lateral moraine. If it's in front, it's called an end moraine or terminal moraine. And the terminal moraine is rather small. It's only about 100 feet tall. And when you look at the material within this lateral moraine, it's typical of glacial material. You see of rocks of all sizes in a finer grained matrix. So, the Ice Age was a real event. And you find all these erratic boulders in places. This is some of the most famous erratic boulders. This is southwest of Calgary, Alberta, Canada. Okotoka erratics. This is quartzite. It does not crop on the plains. It comes from the Canadian Rockies. And there's a trail of these rocks from Jasper, Alberta, down to Cutbank, Montana. It's about 600 kilometers long, very thin. And the fact that this is angular it couldn't have rolled by water. So it was probably carried by an iceberg. Between the two ice sheets in central Canada and in the mountains of the Canadian Rockies, and they merged at one time. But then there was a gap between them for part of the time. And that's probably where you had these icebergs flowing in glacial rivers, forming this trail of erratic boulders. And then you find other erratics, like this is Bubble Rock in Acadia National Park in Maine. I'm showing you some cool Ice Age pictures. And here's a famous one. How many have seen this? This is just a few of you. Well, it's only about 50 miles southwest of here. It's near McMinnville. Now, this is well-known. In fact, there's a sign on this road that advertises it. Anyway, this erratic boulder is argillite, which is a slightly metamorphic shale. Notice the platy look on it. So it's a little hardened shale. No argillite occurs in the whole state of Oregon. The only way you can get this down here is by the Lake Missoula flood, since this location is about 200 kilometers south of the furthest extent of the ice sheet, which came down Puget Sound to a little south of Olympia, Washington. So the only way you can get this here is by the Lake Missoula flood that came through the Columbia Gorge 1,000 feet deep, 80 miles an hour, and backwashed up the Willamette Valley. And that forms your rich topsoil. You actually stole it from eastern Washington. And that's why it's such great agriculture in the Willamette Valley. But you have hundreds of erratic boulders all through the Willamette Valley, of which this is the most unique of them. Most of them are granite. But this is a typical rock of what's called the Belt Supergroup rock that outcrops in northern Idaho and western Montana and extreme northeast Washington. Argillite. So, Lake Missoula flood. And this is a picture of the Lake Missoula flood from space. You can see the path of it, right? Like this, about 100-mile wide braided stream. And this shows up because eastern Washington is a series of basalt flows, the Columbia River basalt. Then on top of it, you have about 100 feet of silt. and that's light colored. The basalt is dark, and the flood eroded the silt and down into the basalt, and from space it shows up this pattern right here. So there was a Lake Missoula flood, and it occurred at the peak of the Ice Age. The valleys of western Montana were filled 2,000 feet deep of meltwater near the Idaho-Montana border, and it broke over and came through eastern Washington, 5 days maybe. So anyway, here's another cool picture. This is actually southern Puget Sound area. This is the Hood's Canal right in here. Notice, now this is a LiDAR picture where they're able to get rid of the vegetation, and this is what it looks like. It's streamlined. These are called drumlins. This is typical Ice Age streamlining, and usually by fast-moving ice. So that's what southern Puget Sound area looks like, north of Olympia. Anyway, I just had to show these cool Ice Age pictures, but I've spent 50 years on this topic, and I've been able to time the Ice Age. By the way, I'm just giving you just quickie on this. You can get more material, and I even probably have a talk or two in your archives on the topic you can look online for. Anyway, the time the Ice Age is to cool the ocean off. If you cool the ocean off, it gives off less water vapor, and so the Ice Age will run out of gas, run out of water vapor, and so it will start melting. So, but there's no way to be accurate with any of these times, so I use maximum and minimums for the variables within the equations. So here's the range I got for the time to reach glacial maximum. The best estimate, I believe, is about 500 years. These are rough estimates, but still, when you use a range, it indicates that the Ice Age was only hundreds of years, possibly up to a little more than 1,000 years. So we can easily fit that into the time after the flood. They claim that Ice Ages take 100,000 years. But when we use biblical variables and look at the data, we come out with different conclusions. This is what we can do with all those claimed features that take too much time, they say. And then the average depth of the ice, I used maximum minimums and got a best estimate about 2,300 feet in the northern hemisphere. And this is just an average, remember. In Montana, where I live, the ice was very thin in north of where I used to live at Great Falls, Montana. There are some mountain ranges on the plains that stood above the ice, and the Cypress Hills in Canada stood 300 feet above the ice. So it was very thin, but you go to New England, I think it was well above average. And here's the figures for Antarctica. And then how fast would it melt? Well, I did the same thing. I used the equations for the melting of snow and ice. I used ranges mainly for the reflectivity. The snow was the main variable. This is along the edge of the ice, the periphery. So the best estimate I got for the edge was 70 years, interior 200 years, so total time for an ice age was only 700 years. So those claims of taking too much time for the biblical time scale evaporate when you stick to the Bible and look at the data. In summary, ages are important for Christians. The genealogies and words of Jesus indicate the earth is young. Numerous problems and assumptions are associated with radiometric dating, and we can explain the millions and billions of years by accelerated radiometric decay. Numerous processes indicate a much younger Earth than the secular scientists say, such as the decay of short-period comets. And claims of slow processes can be accelerated during the flood. So ultimately, it's a worldview issue. How you view the world. Are you going to stick to deep time and uniformitarianism and evolution, or are you going to stick to the Bible? So it's the way you look at it. So if you look at them through evolutionary glasses, believing in evolution, deep time, and you look at it, yeah, you're going to see old ages and stuff like that. But if you look from the Bible, all animals ate plants before in the Garden of Eden. Well, you'd look, if in your evolutionary glasses, that they always ate meat. So it's a different way of looking at it. So it's a worldview issue. So anyway, for those that have a good science background, and there's 2 books on radiometric dating you can get. I don't have them here. They might have them over there. I'm just letting you know that we have a lot of material on this. This is this $1.5 million project called RATE, means radioactivity in the age of the Earth. There's 2 books, this one and this one. So if you really want to get into this, those are the 2 books for you. Anyway, I've written a book on this topic, and this is hopefully for laymen with no science background. That's what I geared it for. They'll have to tell me whether I succeeded. It's called The Deep Time Deception. It's got a subtitle, Examining the Case for Millions of Years, which doesn't show up on this slide. And I've recently written this book with Robert Carter to teach people about basic geology so you can go out and look and see the evidence for the flood out there for yourself. Biblical Geology 101. And Rob Carter is writing Biblical Biology 101, which should be being reviewed by now. Also, Dr. John Reed and myself have done this book explaining how you can explain geology from various stages and phases of the flood, how Noah's flood shaped our earth. And if you want to know about the Ice Age, I've written this book that's layman friendly, Frozen in Time, the Woolly Mammoth, the Ice Age, and the Biblical Key to Their Secrets. My wife and I have written children's books, and we have 5 of them over there. This is one of them, which is a sequel to Life in the Great Ice Age, Uncovering the Mysterious Woolly Mammoth, Life at the End of the Great Ice Age. So, and I have these DVDs that Kyle Justice did with me out in the field for about 90 minutes to 100 minutes, showing you features out there. It's just a little more than a talking head. And I want to leave you with this verse. Your faith should not rest on the wisdom of men. That is, they're trying to explain everything without God. The uniformitarianism, deep time evolution. But on the power of God. God has power to create, to form a flood, and to do it only 6,000 years ago. And it can be defended scientifically. And that's all I have, and I thank you, and there'll be questions and answers after this.
Yes, we have 2 roving microphones for questions and answers.